What are your worst nightmare neighbor conflict stories? This is more of a funny story than a neighbor from hell. But in our apartment, we kept hearing massive bass, think like a rhythm game starting at like 6 p.m. and sometimes going till 11 p.m. And it sounded like it was localized right above our bedroom. Finally, one night I went up and banged on the door, but they didn't answer. About an hour later, I heard people moving around in the apartment above me, so I walked out, hoping to catch them either on the stairs or so I could knock on the door again. I went out and he's walking down the stairs. When he saw me, he asked if I could turn down the bass so he could sleep. It was like the Spider Man meme where they were pointing at each other. I told him I thought it was him the entire time. So after we realized it was neither of us, we walked together and found the noise coming from a building 2 buildings down, and it turned out the dude had a drum set in his closet and was rocking out every night. Since we talked to him, we can still hear it, but he always stops around 8 p.m. now, so it could have been way worse if the guy was a jerk. Another similar experience was when I got stopped by my ex downstairs neighbor when I was in college, and he said if we could keep it down, that'd be great, because his little baby takes naps in the afternoon. I told my roommates, and they were a little confused because we were all in class most of the time. Another time, he knocked and asked us to quit running around and stop throwing whatever we were throwing. It was a Saturday, and we were all just chilling and playing video games. We just kind of said, okay, not sure what you're hearing, but we'll try to keep it down. We were all like 6 foot plus, so maybe we were dragging our feet. About a week later, he wailed on our door and told us to shut the hell up. He couldn't get his baby down. It was just me, and I was literally binge watching Netflix. I probably hadn't gotten up in a few hours. I asked him, "Do you mean our neighbor with a kid?" He went, "What?" I said, "Come on in, let's have a beer, and that Tasmanian devil will probably go wild here in about 10 minutes. Sure enough, the half-monkey neighbor kid was running around, throwing a ball against our wall, etc. He finally got it, and he apologized. He asked me why I hadn't flipped out yet, and we were just a bunch of college kids who didn't want any trouble, pre-legalization. So back to the first part of the story. Guys, that drummer boy was 2 buildings down. Can you imagine actually being the next door neighbor to that guy? Would drive me wild. Story 2. There was an old guy behind named Louie. He was a cranky old fart and had fights with every neighbor. His house's lot was the last on the street, and the crossroad where I live had 4 lots back to his side. So he had 6 lots adjacent to him, and he fought with them all. When I first moved there, I tried to get along, but I had been warned. I planted a garden and he oversprayed chemicals on a lot of my plants, including several nice watermelon plants. He'd yell at me, he'd yell at my dog, my wife said he was saying obscene stuff to her. One day he called me names. I called him a stupid old Goomba, he was Italian, and he acted like I really hurt his feelings. This went on for years and he was keeping neighbors agitated as well. Here's the good part. One day I was at a flea market type thing and I saw him in his little accessibility cart. I tried to stay away. Suddenly, from behind me, I heard him say, "Hey, aren't you the guy that lives behind me?" I said, "Yes," and he popped out his hand to shake, and he said, "How you doing?" And we talked. He was friendly. He told me his wife had a stroke recently and invited me over. I was wondering what was going on. That summer, he saw me and came out to talk, and we chatted. I mentioned I played guitar, and he jumped and said, "Go get it, and I'll bring the wife to the kitchen, and you can play for her." I was stunned. I was shy about playing, but I brought it over, and they thought it was wonderful. One day, he apologized for being cranky before. I apologized back. Louis and I were friends for the next few years. He told me stories of when he was a kid in the 1920s. I just became a good guy. None of my neighbors forgave him, but I did. I assumed his doctor gave him Prozac or something. Anyway, he passed away on September 10th, 2001, the day before the infamy. He was diabetic and took nitroglycerin for his heart. Neighbors said he took his own life, but I knew another guy who couldn't get his nitro on time and passed away. I think he had a medical emergency and could not make the call. About a year ago, he asked me, if something happened to him, to check the door on his lawn shed and make sure it was locked. I checked it. It was locked. Okay, I'm a little bit curious about the ending of this story. What did he have in that shed that he so badly wanted to be locked up? Like dead bodies? Old neighbors? Who knows? Anything's possible. Let's get to the next story. Story 3. My grandpa moved in with my mom. He was probably 82 when this happened. Her neighbors on one side, who only moved in a few months earlier, put up a 3 to 4 full-size deer lawn decorations in their backyard. This wasn't against any HOA rules or anything, and they were tucked into the back corner of their yard near some trees. Anyway, Grandpa decided to go to the store and buy some old lady bloomers. He waited until night after my mom went to sleep, stuck over, and put them on all the deer. The neighbors did not take kindly to this, but did not suspect Gramps at all. Instead, they decided to blame a third neighbor on the other side and retaliated by throwing the bloomers up onto their roof. Now, this resulted in a multi week email chain involving the entire neighborhood association, with tons of finger pointing and increasing anger. Other people complaining about their own vandalism, talking about how much this neighborhood is going downhill, etc. My mom was now trapped between two feuding neighbors, still unaware that her own father had caused all of this. So, like any good prankster who got away with it, he did it again. The email anger kept escalating, with people threatening to involve the police and filing lawsuits for vandalism. Grandpa finally fussed up to my mom, realizing it was getting out of hand. Mom, now infinitely embarrassed, went to both of these neighbors and had to explain why her elderly father did all this for no real reason other than he was bored and thought it would be funny. My mom called me right after this all went down to vent about it. I could tell she was just absolutely furious with him, but I couldn't stop laughing at how hysterical it all was. I love my grandpa. Story 4. At the time, we were living in a new construction neighborhood, one of the nicest in our town. Our next door neighbor was an older lady who lived alone and generally kept to herself. I was very surprised when she knocked on our front door one day and asked if I would walk outside with her. She led me to her backyard and across to the property line for the next house. A family with 2 young kids had moved in there a few months prior. I knew they had kids because the 2 were always outside, even though it was winter. My neighbor lady asked if I smelled anything. I did, but couldn't identify it. "They're cooking in that house," she said. "I wanted you to verify the smell so I know I'm not imagining it." She had owned rental houses and had encountered the smell when tenants ruined one by making illegal substances there. "I'm worried about those kids. You go on home now. I'm going inside to call the police." The cops arrived soon after. The parents were arrested immediately. The dad screamed many swear words towards the older lady's house as 2 officers forced him across the yard and into one of their cars. The mom just kept screaming, "My babies!" as she was taken to a different police car. I couldn't see the kids, but I could hear them screaming and crying. DCS came and took the kids away. They were the first to live in that new house. It had to be completely gutted and redone inside because of the chemicals. That process took nearly a year. The neighbor lady surely heard everything that man yelled, and she probably risked retaliation if he got out on bail. He didn't. But she absolutely saved those 2 kids. This story had a little bit of a twist, eh? If that little old lady knocked on my door and asked me to go walk outside, a part of me would think I was in trouble. Turns out the little old lady turned out to be a superhero. Story 5. Growing up, the neighbor on one side would be rough on the stray barn cats for fun. It broke my heart to find that one out. The other side was a cornfield for years owned by a guy out of state who paid local farmers to plant and harvest. Then that property got sold and it was bought by a family that ran a landscaping business. They would burn green branches, a lot, but only when the wind was blowing directly towards our house. We kept track. We lived in the country, but although our properties were quite long, they weren't particularly wide, so their house was relatively close to ours, and a ton of smoke would come in all the time. My dad started having serious respiratory problems due to all of the smoke, and the dad/business owner would just ignore us or say he didn't care when we asked nicely for him to stop. Finally, my parents went to a lawyer and got a letter that basically said, "You've got to stop or we'll sue you for medical bills." My mom went to deliver the letter, and it just so happened that the guy's father-in-law was there too. He asked my mom what this was all about, and my mom told him. The guy's FIL ripped the neighbor a new one right then and there, apologized, and with a very stern look at our neighbor, assured us it would never happen again. It actually didn't happen again, and my dad recovered once he wasn't breathing smoke all the time. My parents and that neighbor both still live there. They are friendly with him now, but I just can't forgive being that blasé about making my dad seriously ill. Well, that's how the world goes around, with money, and lawyers, of course. Usually when there's a threat of a lawsuit, people start changing their tune, and it turns out to be the same case here. Story 6. A little backstory for context later. I live in a very spacious country subdivision. We are about 25 years younger than the average owner. Everyone has at least an acre. My husband and I personally built a large shed next to a detached garage. It took us about 3 weekends to do it. We also mow our lawn once a week. Our yard is not meticulous, but it is hardly neglected. So we get a letter in the mail one day. It was typed on a typewriter and came from the Upper Smith Neighbor Group, name changed. The letter read, "When you first moved in, I wasn't sure if you had the class, finances, or breeding to be in our illustrious neighborhood. I see that you finally built a place to hide all the junk you insist on keeping in your yard. Now, if you only could do something about that hayfield you call a yard." The junk they were upset about was building materials for the shed that were delivered, used, and cleaned up in 3 weeks. I was so mad, and revenge was first on my mind for weeks. I couldn't figure out how to handle it to my satisfaction. I figured it out right before the 4th of July. I got 2 old toilets and put one on either side of my driveway by the street. I planted red, white, and blue flowers in the bowl and stuck in a couple of small American flags for flair. Then I made a large sign that read, "Thank you, Upper Smith Neighbor Group, for your letter suggesting I take more pride in my yard." I kept them for a whole year, switching out the bowl decorations for every holiday with the wackiest decorations I could find. Alright, so feeling a little too close to your neighbors for comfort after these stories? Alright, so don't worry, we've all been there, I've been there. Please do consider hitting that like button and subscribe to my channel for more neighborly drama and maybe a reminder that you appreciate yours, and mine too, if they're not as bad as the ones that we've read about so far, hopefully. Story 7. I had a neighbor with a work truck, a custom truck, and a custom car. He had so many cars that it was hard to park. When our second son was born, a fourth truck appeared. He rebuilt the thing. His yard was full of body panels instead of grass that summer, and he was always using a metal grinder. He rebuilt the engine and took months to tune it. He'd back it up to as close to our house as he could and would rev the engine, before work, after work, and all day on the weekends. It was impossible to have conversations in our house. He would stop if we left. He would start things like this, create conflict, and act like the victim. I witnessed him yell at the cable installers and the landlord's brother who repainted the house. So after pretending it wasn't getting to me, I called the cops, who told him he couldn't do it after sundown, but sundown doesn't happen until 10 p.m. in Montana. I finally emailed a community resource officer and he shut that down. For the next 2 years, the guy would film me doing something wrong. He had 6 cameras pointing out from his place to ours at all angles. If I was taking out the trash, he'd come out with his phone camera and try to catch me doing something. I don't know. Eventually, his landlord evicted him. He still lives close, though. So with all these nightmare neighbor stories so far, one of the things that worries me is if I call out a neighbor, or worse yet, call the cops on a neighbor, I'm kind of scared that the neighbor is going to come back and get some retribution. Does that freak you guys out too? I'm kind of half hoping that there's a story coming up just like that one. At least I might be able to find out what my options could be from learning from their story. Let's find out. Story 8. Our first house was in a working-class post-World War II suburban neighborhood. The houses were a single driveway's width plus about 2-3 feet of open yards. We moved in early spring with our then 2-year-old, so we were spending time outside when our new neighbors in their 70s came home. We smiled and waved. They came over to introduce themselves, and the first thing the lady said was, "I have something to say to you people. Don't blow the snow up against our house. If you get water in our basement, we will sue you." Okay, nice to meet you too. And this was the beginning of the most ridiculous neighborly relationship I think I've ever had. I nannied another little boy, and she would come knock on our door and tell me to shut those damn kids up before I call CPS on you. They were running around my house, which I owned, or the yard, being happy, loud kids. Eventually, I had enough. I ended up calling the non-emergency line. Then things got really weird. She would wake up at like 7 a.m. and bang on all the windows that faced our house. She'd open them and bang them shut repeatedly. She would pound her fists on them. Then around about 7:30 to 8, she would walk out to her car after slamming the door and shake her keys as loud as she could. She'd throw them on the ground, pick them up, shake them, and throw them down again. Then she'd leave for the morning. She would also randomly come wandering over, trying to give me $1 for my son's birthday or being tearful and wanting to come into our house. I wonder if she wasn't entering some form of dementia. They sold their house about a year after we moved in. In my non-professional opinion, because like many of the Redditors here, I'm not a doctor, I want to think it's dementia. Because who grabs their keys, shakes them, throws them on the ground, picks them up, shakes them again, throws them down again, and repeats about 2 or 3 times, all before 8 a.m.? Story 9. My current neighbor loves to pick fights with all the neighbors. She lives in the cul-de-sac off my street. Instead of coming to us directly about issues she has, she speed dials the city. So she had an issue with a tree in our backyard. A small branch fell onto her lawn from my tree during an ice storm a year ago and decided to wage war on all the trees near her property. So she called the city to make us cut the tree down. It was completely healthy, just leaning over her property slightly. The city sided with her. It had to come down. We had just 3 weeks to get it down or we got fined. So we called the place that can do it with a crane as long as the machine can go on her front lawn. And you can see where this is going. My mother went to her and explained that the crane needed to go on her lawn to get the tree she wanted down. She replied that it's fine and anything she can do to help. Then the day of, the arborists were ready to cut it down, and she decided she was no longer okay with the vehicle being on her lawn. So not only did the process get delayed by 3 days, pushing us close to the deadline, we also had to get a bigger crane to do it from the cul-de-sac. This one decision of hers cost an extra $6,000, which came out of my pocket. My parents are retired and old, and deferred my education for a year. Oof, that would piss me off so much. Over a tree, no school, over a crazy lady. And I have a feeling we got a couple more crazies coming up. Story 10. My boyfriend and I had a next door neighbor around our age who we thought seemed alright. Laid back professional, rented the house with his girlfriend, smoked grass, nothing really noteworthy. His girlfriend eventually left him, and we watched the dude slowly lose his mind after that. After a series of episodes of his screaming arguments on the phone or when his ex would stop by, we eventually saw it peak when he took a hammer to his cabinets. Our bedroom window had a direct view of his balcony and kitchen window. I was falling asleep when I started hearing a repetitive banging sound and looked out the window to see his perfectly lit kitchen window. And the window was our neighbor, just smashing the ever-loving crap out of his kitchen cabinets. I know the landlord just renovated and those cabinets were brand new. He was demolishing his frickin' kitchen while screaming and laughing, and we could see everything from the comfort of our own bed. He wasn't able to see us, and I remember being frozen while witnessing this man just unhinge from reality like that. I grabbed my boyfriend as a witness to the event, and the neighbor eventually calmed down and left the kitchen from our view. I don't think I slept much that night. The property manager saw us outside a few weeks later and told us that he moved. Then she told me she thinks the rental is cursed because it's broken up the last 3 couples she moved in. Story 11. My old neighbors were a nightmare. They would start rumors about me, kept phoning the police on me for literally nothing, filmed me without my consent because, quote, we have to document your behavior, kept reporting me to the local authorities for noise violations even when I was in another country for a month, would send threatening letters, did thousands of pounds of worth of damage to my car over the space of a year, scratching it, kicking it, lifting up their dog to do their business on the hood, break my windows, then complain to the authorities about my broken windows, got my benefits stopped. One of them worked for the tax office and kept flagging my income as suspicious, left garbage in my garden and then reported me for it, claiming it was there for longer than it was, phoned the police saying I was having a rave, phoned the police saying I was dealing, yep, outside the odd drink, I don't touch anything, claiming I was bad-mouthing them on social media, and one time claimed I tried to run them over with my car when they refused to move out of the way, causing me to block all the traffic behind me. Now the sad part is that they're also doing the same thing to the current family in the house, and I'm helping them make a counter case to get them into trouble for it. Well, to be completely 100% fair, they were right about this Redditor bad-mouthing them on social media, am I right? Not really. Story 12. I lived next door to an Airbnb house. At first, it was fine, but then during tourist season, the house was rented out to some dude who decided to invite all his boys over for a lovely party on a Tuesday till after midnight in the pool next to my bedroom window and blocked our driveway with all their cars. We spent the next 6 months calling the police non-emergent line for one thing or another as a barrage of events unfolded. Other fun mentionables were loud pool parties till 2 or 3 in the morning, goth metal music blaring from a stereo that made our windows shake on that side of the house, garbage left sprawled on our yard, and cars parked in our driveway because theirs was full. I eventually contacted the owners through the Airbnb listing and explained that if they didn't find tenants that could respect the residential area, I would be happy to talk to the HOA about putting in an ordinance against short-term rentals for our area. Needless to say, after 6 months of BS, they put the house up for sale and we finally had a nice neighbor who moved in. Peace at last. Does this story remind you guys of that one movie with Seth Rogen and what's his name with the abs? Zac Efron? Bad Neighbors, was it? Yeah, that's exactly what I was seeing while I was reading this story to you guys. Let's find out what happens in the next story. Story 13. Our neighbor kept complaining that the plants by the shared fence in our garden were dragging it down and ruining the plants climbing on her side. You only had to glance at the fence to see that it was massively weighed down on her side. It was sort of a wire fence and it was stretched and bowed on her side so that it practically touched the ground. We had a few plants against the fence on our side, but nothing like she did. She kept insisting it must be our fault. When we moved out, we hired a couple of gardeners to just tidy up the garden a bit for the next tenants. We left them to it and went inside to pack. When we checked on them later, we found that the neighbor had come in and told them to get rid of all our plants by the fence, which technically belonged to the landlord. And instead of coming back to check with us, they just totally ripped out every flower bed along the fence on the say so of some random stranger. And of course, it made no damn difference to the fence whatsoever. Wow, some of these nightmare neighbor stories are enough to make anyone want to move to a deserted island. But hey, before you do pack your bags, check out the next video coming up. How did that crazy neighbor become the crazy neighbor? Story 2 has some next level weirdness going on next door. I'll see you there, and thank you for watching this one.